With a new president taking office, many groups around the country are setting benchmarks for the state of the nation. Our guest is with a group that chose the recent Martin Luther King holiday to issue its report on the state of the dream. We'd like to welcome from United for a Fair Economy, we'd like to welcome the Director of Communications, Mike Leyba. Thank you very much for being with us, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, what we've been hearing with this change of power in Washington is that things have steadily been getting better under President Obama, and we can just hope it continues with the new president, Donald Trump. But what are you looking at when you're trying to take your measure of things here? Sure.
So I look at a lot of different variables when I think about wealth and when I think about the economic reality for Americans. In my experience, when people talk about wealth, they're not necessarily talking about what's in their bank account or what assets they have to their name. They're usually talking about things like opportunity, like inclusion, and financial stability. So there are a lot of different areas where people have some ground to make up. And that's the economic reality. We hear great news out of Washington, but a lot of times that doesn't necessarily match up with what we see in communities.
Speaking of stability, because it's interesting you say stability instead of pay, or even talking about inequality in wages, because I keep hearing that we're entering this age where jobs are going to be replaced by gigs. I mean, how does that feel for most people, you think?
I think that's a real reality that we have to contend with. I don't think automation and I don't think mechanization of jobs is going to go away. I think it's something that we as I have lots of friends and myself I consider myself to be part of a movement for social justice, and that's something that we're frankly behind on, thinking about what is the future of labor, what is the future of work, how are the dynamics between employer and employee shifting, and that's something that we have to be more aware of.
Well, one thing that's certainly swayed a lot of votes in this last presidential election is the inability of either major party to cope with the loss of industrial jobs that used to be really well-paying jobs too. What about your report? Does your report address that in some way?
Well, there definitely has been a loss of jobs in certain sectors.
Especially for people without college education, I should add too, right?
Right, yeah, and I think the takeaway out of our report that's related to that is even if you are employed, that the real wages for employed people have gone down over time. When you take into account inflation, when you take into account cost of living, if somebody is making the minimum wage anywhere in the country, when you adjust that for inflation, it's down 24% since 1968. That's a real that's causing many families to feel the squeeze, to feel financially like they can't do it. And that's, I think, a lot of what's contributing to the economic anxiety, which has been so prominent in the election.
What about the ability of people to improve their pay by maybe improving their jobs, maybe getting education or training? Anything different to talk about along those lines?
Yeah, so we definitely do look at education in this report. We look at education is something that's really complicated when you study. You can study outcomes, you can study a bunch of different variables along the way, but to actually make sense of all that in a way and draw direct correlations is very difficult. But I can tell you that that in terms of education, that I think our public schools are largely underfunded. They're largely failing our students, and frankly, that affects communities of color and working class communities much more than it affects people that can, say, send their child to private school. So that's where this inequality really manifests, and is that we have two systems. We have one system that's public, underfunded, and disinvested, and you also have a private system which provides it sets people up for a successful remainder of their life.
We're talking with Mike Leyba from United for a Fair Economy. Mike, what about the problems with inclusion? I mean, it could be a racial gap in learning, it could be the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, but where do you see the biggest need for more progress on that front?
So we have a lot of room to improve for inclusion, and one of the things that we learned when doing this report is that no matter if you're looking at LGBT inclusion or education or wages, wealth, or housing, or assets, there are significant gaps in when you break it down by race. And the reason is because this inequality started hundreds of years ago, and it's been shaped by hundreds of years of both articulated policy in the government as well as social policy, which either boost or block certain types of marginalized groups from getting access to those things.
What about the way to get more of that access? Because it depends to a large degree on who's in elective office, especially in Congress and the White House. But other than that, what should people be thinking about?
I think people should be thinking about the fact that these outcomes exist today and that they have very deep roots. There may be some policy, some social policy, which might move the needle a little bit on it. But ultimately, I don't think that, especially the incoming administration, I don't necessarily think they see the role of government as one that has any obligation to lift the floor for people. And that's something that even in the US, we subscribe to this kind of notion of the self-made man, the self-made millionaire, the self-made person. When in reality, a lot of that wealth comes from public investment. It comes from quality schools, it comes from infrastructure investment, it comes from patent law, it comes from a court system and a property system. So like all of those things are things that we as taxpayers are flipping the bill for. And yet somehow this wealth gets concentrated into the hands of very few. And those very few take that money, invest it, they don't need it, they don't need all of it at this exact moment. They invest it, they make more money off of it. So it's creating this cycle. And as we stand today, there's a huge gap between the richest and the poor.
Well, supporters of the president say that if you cut taxes for business people and the wealthy, and if you reduce regulation, there's going to be this burst of confidence. There are going to be all these new jobs, and people will feel, they'll feel relatively wonderful, I guess. What do you think of that likelihood?
I'm sure the president would feel relatively wonderful about that. I think that it says a lot about the state of our nation that Donald Trump, a self-proclaimed billionaire, found his way into the Oval Office. I think it says a lot about what opportunity means in this country. I think it says a lot about what people are willing to believe in this kind of, I don't want to say, the savior kind of complex that exists in people, in communities where they just want to get ahead. And so I would challenge that notion, and I would say that I definitely do think that there are places where law could get smarter and can be updated. I mean, we just talked about mechanization and robotics. That's something where the law needs to catch up to reality and to the social environment that we live in. But I also do think that my confidence in Congress isn't exactly really high in addressing those critical, urgent issues.
Any advice out there for people as far as organizing and how to build on that to get the utmost?
I think now is as good a time as any to get involved. I think, we saw this last weekend, millions of people out in the streets,
the Women's March,
both domestically and internationally. And even the day before that, locally, there were some really great marches that brought together groups that don't typically, work together. And so I find that to be a sign of hope. So to anybody who's watching this today, I would encourage you to definitely find an organization, find a movement, find a group of people, start a reading circle. Just do something to where democracy is not something that you exercise once every 4 years. That's a habit that we as Americans need to change. And I feel very optimistic. So find somewhere to get involved vigorously, and work together with other people.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
From United for a Fair Economy, Mike Leyba. We'll have more news in just a moment.